You're listening to Edge Radio TV. The views and opinions expressed in this program are that of the hosts or guests, and not the Edge Radio Network or its advertisers or affiliates.
It's a movement. We're talking about unity. We're talking about unity. So we're aimed to taking down the system of race by educating, enlightening, informing, and positively debating with those who have counterviews.
Welcome to Edge Radio's Talk About Unity, and today's episode we've entitled Critical Thinking, Why It's So Important. And we just think we've got a really great show for you today, because as always, we've got our resident race deconstructionist, George Middleton, and today he's going to play our resident critical thought expert. And so we're going to have a really good discussion with him today. And as always, I never have excess minutes with George. And so we're going to go ahead, make sure we've got George in here loud and clear. So George, you got us loud and clear today?
Testing 1 2, testing 1 2. Can you gentlemen hear me?
Outstanding. We've got him. So we're ready to go. And so I got George Middleton. We got him on, and I want to introduce right here in studio. Y'all might think that Richard Jennings has turned a little darker, a few darker shades, but that's not what's happened here. Today I've got my boy in here from a founder of Applied Pressure, Mr. Peyton Logan, and we want to welcome him to the Edge Radio studio. Welcome there, Peyton.
Thank you for having me on.
All right. So now with both of these gentlemen in, I want to talk about what we're doing on the show for today. We've got some really good information we want to cover, because you've known, if you've been watching Talk About Unity and you've seen George Middleton and myself kind of running around on Facebook and the like, you've seen some of the things we've talked about concerning race, and we sometimes get into these heated discussions about the idea. And a lot of it boils down to the topic that we're going to talk about today, and that is critical thinking. And so as I began researching this idea of race many years ago, it came, I began to realize that people had a very hard time comprehending and asking hard questions about concepts, beliefs, and things such as this race concept is. And so what I realized is that there's got to be something that flips the switch, and I think this might be it today when we talk about critical thought and critical thinking, how people get there. Because I tell you what, the truth is out there, but we've got to seek it. And one of the things we got to do is we've got to ask questions. And so I think I've got two great purveyors of question asking here today from both different ends of the spectrum. George Middleton, of course, is a cognitive behavioral therapist, and he goes really deep when he starts asking questions. And see, if you're a person like me, which really messes with your mind, you're trying to figure out the question he's asking, you'll get all mixed up, so you need to just answer the questions. But he's got those questions. And then Peyton Logan from the other end of the spectrum is a guy who was just always curious. And as he, as a youngster, he founded Applied Pressure because he always had this desire to push forward, ask those hard questions. He calls it Applied Pressure. And that's what he does. He asks those hard questions. So you might think he's sitting back in the cut, but the next question Peyton's going to ask is going to be one that makes you think about what you're actually doing. So we got it from both ends of the spectrum. And so before we get to that, I want to talk about some of the facts about this critical thinking that we're going to cover today. There was I want to put up that graphic, Vince, that has the a study by a German psychologist named Hermann Ebbinghaus, and he identified that students forget 95% of what they learn in high school after 3 days. Did you hear that? Not 3 years, after 3 days. So what does that mean is happening? I can tell you what's happening, because for being a high school teacher, they memorize temporarily and then to discard that information as soon as they're done with it, which is the exact opposite of this idea that we have of critical thinking. And so our public education system, I really believe, and you'll probably find that out during our conversation today as I discuss this, you're going to find out that I'm talking about our public education system is at fault not for just, many people talk about the fact that we don't teach real history. We don't teach real thinking is our problem. Because if we taught real thinking, then they would seek out that real history and they would find it. So that's kind of where we're going to go on our show today. And normally, I take some time to do a lot of introductory and talk about the news that's happening. I'm not going to do that today. We're going to go straight into this and begin talking about this. And so I want to start out by looking at this definition that we have of what critical thinking really is. And so Vince, you could put up that graphic that shows this definition of critical thinking. And it says that critical thinking, and we probably will stay on some of these words because George will use some words like this, I'm sure, as he begins talking. And so you might need to write this down and so we can analyze it. But it says critical thinking is the objective analysis and evaluation of an issue in order to form a judgment. Now, one of the key words there at the end there where it says in order to form a judgment. Most of the time we make our judgments based off of what? Who knows? Because, and that's where we get that word prejudge or prejudice, because we usually prejudge. So we're not using objective analysis and evaluation in order to make these judgments. And so let's start out by talking about that definition, George. Now, is there anything that, George, you would say needed to be added, subtracted, or expanded upon in that definition as we go forward?
I think it's a good definition. If I were going to add to it, I would probably add something in a line of something that's is connected to yourself as the basis for that assessment. Knowing your individual self, knowing your objective self, because your own identity is going to be the first, the first filter of assessment that you're going to use in any assessment way, in any form of objective attempts to get to the truth of something. So not knowing who you are objectively can have a major impact on your own process of critical thought.
So is that going to make our prejudgment more extreme if we lack that identity piece? Is that what you're saying? You're going to make a more extreme prejudgment, therefore less critical thinking? Is that what we're saying here? If you don't have a basis for, I guess you're saying you don't understand that you have this particular judgment or bias or stereotype. If you don't have that because you don't understand who you are, then you inevitably are going to not be able to think critically about it or objectively about it. Is that what we're saying?
Right. So in the definition, it begins the objective analysis. So that means that the person who's doing the analyzing has the ability to be objective. And if you don't objectively know your own identity, right? And if you're not objectively aware of how your identity, whether it's ideological, ethnic, racial, cultural, whatever that identity is, if you're not understanding how that can impact your ability to objectively analyze, then that's going to impact the outcome of any critical attempt at thought.
Right. Okay. So very key. Objective. Very key. So the question is, how do we get on the road to objective? And so that's what we're talking about here. All right. So now I got Peyton in here. And when I was teaching high school, I often evaluated the critical thinking skills based on the questions that were asked by my students. And Peyton, as I said before, was one of those students. And I would say he still is one of my students, all right, because he's always there with me and I'm always teaching. And here's the thing, one of the things I learned was that when I think I'm teaching, I'm actually learning. And so I get that from Peyton too. So, and he asked a lot of good questions. So Peyton, what do you think about this whole thing about critical thinking, and why do you have the feeling you have about questioning? Because you ask questions. You're a questioning person.
Absolutely.
How did you get there? Why did you get there? And where do you hope to go from that?
Absolutely. Like I said, I team up with George and what he was coming from. And my viewpoint on it, it's a crucial yet judged way of thinking. You have to do some deep thinking when you're analyzing this stuff, and regardless of wherever the topic is at hand. It takes time. With me, I always sought out the answers of truth or whatever the case might be. Just as if a tunnel, at the end of that tunnel, you always seek out that light. And so you have to go through phases of life in order to get there. It's a lot of clutter and you have to get through it in order to get what you're truly asking for with the light.
So as a young man, are you looking for, when your questioning begins, are you in fact seeking what they have, or are you asking for your edification? So in other words, how does that work for a youngster when you're asking questions about things, and how does that work on your thought ability?
Absolutely. Well, pretty much what I do, I'll find a correlation of something that we agree upon, where so is something that we don't agree on, and I just analyze it. I go with facts and try to get factual information from them, and try to find facts of my own, which I already have, and that's how we get down and try to get down to the gist of it.
Okay, so it sounds like a lot of interchange. So the key for critical thought, and I think this is part of what George was talking about on the road to objectivity. The only way you're going to do that is if you can understand where the other is coming from and where you are coming from. So there's some exchange there that has to happen. So when we come back, we're going to take a short commercial break here, and we come back, George. I'm gonna not only advertise, but I'm going to talk about your Critical Thought podcast that begins tomorrow. I really want to talk about that. I want to do some great advertising, because I tell you what, that's what, if America needs anything, it's George Middleton's Critical Thought podcast. All right, that's what we're going to need. So we're going to talk about that when we come back after this radio break.
Five, four, three, two, one. Zero, ignition, liftoff.
Don't push me because I'm close to the edge.
I'm trying not to lose my head.
Hey, this is the Talk About Unity show where I bring the talk.
And I bring the unity.
And together we talk about unity. Unity is what matters.
Come on.
And right now in our country, that's what we've got to do. So we do that here at Talk About Unity on the Edge Radio Network. Be with us every week.
It's going to be awesome. It always is. And I tell you what, the more we seek first to understand, then be understood, we make progress.
And we like to do that. And that's why everybody's on the brink. We love what we do at Edge Radio, because everybody's on the edge. We bring them back from the edge, and we bring the unity. So we're just glad. Edge Radio Network, every Tuesday morning, 10 a.m. Talk About Unity, because here at Edge Radio Network, truth still matters.
Edge Radio TV is holding auditions for new show hosts. Are you a subject matter expert, professional, influencer, book author, thought leader, or business owner with an educational or motivational platform? Then we want to meet you. Send a link of some of your work to edgeradio20@gmail.com and be sure to put audition in the subject line. Join the Edge Radio TV family. Edge TV, because truth still matters.
And we're back here on Talk About Unity on Edge Radio Network. And I'm delighted to have in studio today my boy Peyton Logan of Applied Pressure. And also coming in virtually, I've got my boy George Middleton out of Indianapolis, Indiana. And I tell you what, he's so many things. I don't know how many titles I'm going to give him, because every time I give him one title, he moves on to another one. But I want to right now do a big plug right now for George Middleton as he premieres his Critical Thought podcast on tomorrow. When I saw that graphic for and I should have had that in my on my presentation day, and I don't have it because I should have given you that air. But let me tell you, when I saw that George Middleton was doing a Critical Thought podcast, I went, how perfect, how perfect. Because George Middleton is the person who would do a Critical Thought podcast, because everything that he does as a cognitive behavioral therapist is to make you think. And that's what we're talking about on today's show. We were talking about critical thinking and why it's so important. So George, I'm going to give you some time here. Just lay it out, George. What do you want to do with your Critical Thought podcast? Because I want everybody to tune in. So I'm going to give you a chance to explain what it's about and why you created it.
Well, Garland, first of all, thank you very much for giving a significant part of your platform to exposing the work I'm doing, because you're doing on your own, you're doing great work. And I really appreciate you taking the time to recognize what I'm also trying to do. Yes, tomorrow is the premiere of my first episode of Deconstructing Race. And the platform, it's a platform of racial deconstruction. That is what I call my methodology. And it's for collective, solution-based discussion in addressing all the polarizing issues that we're being inundated with on a daily basis, as it refers to race in politics, race in law enforcement, race in education, race in finance, race and disparities. It's all connected. You can't go anywhere these days without having race front and center within your cognizant awareness. And racial deconstruction is a 3-step process. First step is education. Second step is self-reflection. And then the third and most important step is application. How do you take all of the assessments, the information you gain from your assessments and your self-reflection, and apply it in a way that moves yourself forward towards your goal and moves the community that you care about forward towards its goals? And so that's pretty much it in a nutshell.
And so your podcast, how often will your podcast run, and where can people actually connect to that thing starting tomorrow?
Starting tomorrow, there'll be a new podcast episode every Wednesday. You can catch it in the morning. It'll be uploaded every morning, every Wednesday. It is based in Indianapolis, Indiana, off of the Wish TV8 platform, and then they also spread it out on a host of their other social media outlets. And then I will also have them posted on my YouTube page, The George Middleton.
Outstanding. Hey, one of the things I heard you talked about solutions-based. When you say solutions-based, what will solutions look like for some of the things that you were talking about? What will some of those solutions look like?
So the goal is to teach the listeners, to help the listeners learn how to deconstruct race from their thinking. In other words, to be aware of when their racial belief system is having an impact on something objective that you're trying to perform a process of critical thought about. And so that will look different based on the organization or agenda or goal that you're looking for. But the principles are the same, because ultimately you're serving your fellow man. And what goes on in most systems of service are services that produce systemic disparities. And you can track those disparities on a statistical manner. They're tracked and recorded on a daily and annual basis. So learning to identify those disparity connected behaviors within your organization or within your individual personhood in order to improve the outcomes of whoever's life you're trying to improve.
Now, let me ask you this. Does one of those have to happen first before the other one happens? Because if I'm in an organization, or can it happen either way? If I'm in an organization, then they've got their issues with being able to identify that within the organization. But if I have that problem in myself, am I going to be more unable to have the organization do it if I haven't done it in myself? Or how does that work? What's the interchange between myself and my organization?
Man, that is such an excellent, nuanced observation, Carlin. You hit the nail right on the head. That's why I make this process more towards the goal of the organization or the individual. It doesn't necessarily require you to change your mind, because that's not the goal of my work. My goal is not to change your mind. My goal is to help you become more aware of your mind, be more aware of the thinking you're doing as it refers to race and the services or the profession that you're in, and be able to identify them. And my issue isn't so much with the conscious, intentful person who has racial motivations, racial motivations, whether you're a white nationalist or KKK or whatever that color hate-based group you might belong to. It's more for the person who really does want to do something more positive, wants to move the dial forward within our country as it pertains to race, but just has no idea how to do it. And so this process that I'm offering gives you that process, that objective, critical thinking process with which to first do some self-reflection and increase the awareness of how you have been personally impacted by race. And we all have. Some of us like to believe, race has never impacted me. I don't have any issues with that. Maybe not. But I would challenge you to go through my process just to see if your self-assessment on that is true.
And so you made the statement in there that says, so the process is not to change your mind, but understand that there are different things out there. So not necessarily to change your mind. So if someone does this, I mean, ultimately at the end of the day, aren't they? So it's just the belief that when people look at this objectively, that ultimately that their minds will change. If they actually begin to reflect and begin looking at themselves, that their minds will change. And so, in other words, this is the Jedi mind games that these cognitive behavioral therapist guys play. They get into your mind where they're doing this thing and saying this thing, and it makes you think. And that's the essence of what we're talking about. What I get from what you're telling us, George, is that when we go into an organization and we'll say, hey, here's some things that you need to look at from your organization's viewpoint. Do you have some biases, prejudices? Are you evaluating your organization's aims and goals? And they get very objective about that. And then as those people do that, they begin to think, wow, they have to involve themselves in that thought process, which then connects them to themselves, to the fact that, wow, I've got to think about this as work. It's like when you go to work every day and you have to deal with certain people in a certain environment, and you go home, you think about that stuff and it becomes a part of you. Mm-hmm. And so It seems like while you say that the objective is not to change minds, there's got to be this belief that ultimately minds will change when they get new information. Would you say that's true?
Well, I understand the logic that you're using with that statement. However, what does it mean to change somebody's mind? I think really what you're doing is making the potential of changing your decisions based on what you know, right? Because our minds absorb everything. Even the things we forget, we remember, right? So you don't really change your mind, increase and add to your mind. And change are the decisions that you make in certain situations. So the motivation is in service of others, right? Otherwise, why are we even having a discussion? If what we're thinking has no impact on anyone else, what's the purpose? We're having this because we're trying to make our environments better. We're trying to make our families better. We're trying to make our country better. So in order to do that, we have to be increasingly aware of how we're thinking, increasingly aware of our past, definitely aware of our present, and very thoughtful about our future. So it's really about having the ability to make important and relevant decisions based on increased awareness.
That's really good, really good. All right, and that takes us back to our definition. We talked about those judgments that we're going to be making. They have to be made off of more and better information. That's what he's talking about. And so you're going to have this objective analysis is going to give you more and better information upon which to make a judgment. Really good stuff there. All right, so we're going to take another break, and when we come back, George, we're going to get deeper because we're going to talk about I've got down here later on 3 reasons that they're going to be Carlin's 3 reasons that you may have a critical thinking problem. And so while we'll be talking about those, then George will be analyzing those and saying, are those valid or not? All right, so we're going to do that as soon as we come back here on Talk About Unity. And we're back live here at Edge Radio Network. And I've got my guest in, George Middleton from Indianapolis, Indiana. He's got a Deconstructing Race Critical Thought podcast, which airs tomorrow. And so we want to make sure everybody tunes into that. So he'll give that plug again before we exit the show today for sure. And I've got in the studio today, Peyton Logan, one of my lifelong students and one of my lifelong teachers. And he's the founder of Applied Pressure. And we're talking about critical thought. And so we're going to turn the corner and talk about some more of this. And but we've talked so far theoretically about the definition of critical thinking and what it is. But one of the things I've realized, and I see this kind of in all phases of life as I go about day to day, especially when I watch the news, almost everything that comes up on the news, I think of it as an issue of, some critical thinking is missing there. And so I want to talk about how that has some very real consequences, I think, in everyday life. And I want to just bring up one current issue that's in the news, and I look at it as being the origin of the COVID virus. And the way that we've been talking about that. So it was more than a year, almost a year and a half ago now that we discovered the COVID virus. And just this past week, maybe 2 weeks ago, I heard President Biden say he was going to get a commission to give them 90 days to figure out where it came from. So in my mind, I'm going, we've been dealing with this for a year and a half. We've got a commission now, just now happened 2 weeks ago, to find out, to give them 90 days. So we'll be at, more than a year and a half, a year and 9 months, if he gives them 90 more days to find out where this came from. And here's where the questioning comes in. This is why I like Peyton. This is why I like George, because they're people of questions. Nobody asked that question before and said, gee, where did this thing come from? Right. And the sad thing is that if somebody did say that, then somebody else probably just said, well, we'll get around to that later. Or, yeah, they said this. And they didn't ask deeper questions. And so, George, what do you think? I mean, and so I'm making the point that this critical thinking happens in everyday life, and it has real consequences, and people suffer when we don't think, and especially people in leadership positions don't think critically. What do you say about that, George?
Yes, the COVID virus issue is just an excellent example of how everything that we're trying to do applies. To speak about COVID-19 objectively, and to assess it objectively, you've got to strip off several layers of bias. You got to strip off the racial filter that is going through. You have to strip off the partisan filter, politically partisan filter that is going through, and you have to strip off the patriotic filter that is going through. Because all three of those areas are significantly providing an obstacles to getting down to the origin of the virus, the impact of the virus, and the potential path that the virus may take. So you ask the question, why is this question just now being asked? Maybe it's because we're finally starting to come into maybe the eye of the hurricane, where there's just a period of peace and rest before the other part of the storm kicks in. Because believe me, there's going to be the other half of the hurricane coming through. It's just a period of rest right now. So this is a time to really stop and look through your racial bias, your ideological partisan biases, your American first biases, all these things that have nothing to do with an objective virus condition.
So how does someone, especially if you do that part of it, and in our definition it talked about the objective analysis, how is our society able to handle that? Does our society do a very good job of handling objective analysis? Like if you are a politician and you do objective analysis and you're objective, if you are in an organization and you're objective, and so it seems like in our society today that is shunned. And that's another reason perhaps we don't get to critical thinking. How are you perceived when you do objective analysis? Because I've seen George Middleton's Facebook posts, and I've seen what happens when he comes out there and says something very objective. And so how do we deal with that in a society that prefers you be hot or cold, one side or the other? How do we deal with that?
Because in our society, emotion sells, objectivity does not. Emotion is the formula to success for most of these platforms that you're in. And so objectivity requires a calmness, an ability to take your time, to breathe, to a willingness to be quiet, a willingness to not speak for a minute. That doesn't sell on most of the platforms we're looking at. It's the emotional stuff. It's the lack of thought and just knee-jerk responses that everybody's tuning in for. That's what's selling, right? So it's doing great for those who are profiting off of the lack of objectivity, but it is completely destroying the social fabric of our country.
Okay, so let's talk about that for a second. Remember, we talked about, and we've had a couple of shows now in Georgia. We talked about critical race theory, and one of the issues I always had initially with the origin of critical race theory was that I said when you make assumptions, you're not being critical when you make assumptions. So that was one of the problems I had. But people, there's not only just critical race theory now. There's critical legal studies from which critical race theory descended, and so a lot of other things that talk about critical. What's the difference between that critical, when we talk about critical thinking, and what we get out of the idea of these critical theories that are coming out? What's the difference there?
Well, listen, first of all, just like I'm curious about Peyton's experience with critical race theory, because I'm assuming Peyton is much younger than I am, correct?
Absolutely.
So, Peyton, my question to you would be, did you take critical race theory when you were in any of your academic programs in high school, middle school, college? Have you taken an official critical race theory course?
No, sir, not at all. My theories and my understanding of my viewpoints on such things is through communication, dialoguing. You know, it's not much with education and coming from that point of perspective, but going in the street, speaking to different backgrounds and ethnicities and getting their point of view on things. So as far as education, it's great, and I've been to about 3 different universities, but most of my understanding is through dialoguing and speaking to the next man.
And when you're speaking with your generation on issues of race, does critical race theory ever come up? Do you speak about race in an objective fashion? Well, what's the nature and tenure of the discussions that you're having at your age group?
From my generation perspective, like I said, we just see what goes on the news. I'm not much of a news watcher, but what's spread amongst the world, just as the George Floyd situation, you know, that's apparent to everyone, and that's an eye opener.
Right.
And
see from that.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Sorry, Peyton. Go ahead.
No, I was listening to your question.
Yeah, and so from that, Carlin, just listening to Peyton's experience, that's what's missing. There's no intentional vehicle to address critical race theory, to address race ideology. Thank God we have intelligent people like Peyton, who is looking at things from a more critical and objective manner. But unfortunately, we don't have that. The majority of our community don't have minds like Peyton, don't have interests like Peyton, in terms of being willing to look at things from a more objective and critical.
Of course, he's a Carlin Charleston product, so of course he's going to. But you're right. You're right, and that's why I say that when I was introducing Peyton in the beginning, I said not only was I his teacher, but I was learning from him, because that is few and far between, and so that's a good point, because you didn't have. I don't have many youth who just question and objectively question and want to know the truth. You know, so most people enter into the fray already with a bias or feeling based on emotion, because it's what my friends said, it's what my parents told me, it's what they've already, and they don't have the objective analysis part. So, yeah. But George, what I want to do though, I want to get that critical, because of course, is when they talk critical race theory, does that mean what's the critical part about it?
When who talks it?
The idea of critical race theory from the beginning. I just want to get the American people to understand, because I think people are going to misuse or misidentify what they're talking about if they just say critical race theory and they hear us talking about critical thinking and critical thought. I want to draw a distinction between what we're talking about when we say critical thinking and this idea of critical theory or critical race theory.
Well, it's important first to be able to parse out who is speaking about it, because there's going to be a different agenda based on the organization. Mm-hmm. If it's a political group talking about CRT, whether it's the right or the left, trust and believe there are going to be some political motivations behind bringing that up. If it's a erased race group, or if it's a deconstructing race group like mine or yours, our motivation for discussion of CRT is going to be totally different. So don't lump the discussion of CRT under they. Only deal with it with whoever is bringing it up, and tie it to whatever their mission is, because chances are they're bringing it up in support of their mission.
Oh, okay, good. All right, well, cool. So we're talking critical thinking on the show today, and we've got a lot of that coming up. And so as soon as we come back after this break, we got Carlin's 3 reasons you may have a critical thinking problem. And George and Peyton are going to weigh in on them as we go. And so we're going to do that as soon as we come back. And we're going to make sure we hit all 3 of these, because we got a lot to talk about on these. And we'll do that as soon as we come back after this break.
When people stop talking to each other, society is on the edge. Let's bring them back. Edge Radio, because truth still matters.
And we're back here and talk about unity on our broadcast today about critical thinking and why it's so important. And we're at a key point in the show where we're going to talk about Carlin's 3 reasons you may have a critical thinking problem. And we got George here, we've got Peyton here, and you've heard them already, and they're going to be weighing in as we go through these. And so let's go ahead and cut to, and let's go to the first reason. If you can put that up, there we go. Here's 3 reasons. Now, understand these are Carlin's 3 reasons. These are not vetted. They haven't been vetted even by George. He didn't screen and say, Carlin, you can't say that. So that means they really haven't been vetted at all. But these are Carlin's 3 reasons critical thinking may be your problem. And we're going to start out with the big one. And number 1 reason I think that critical thinking may be your problem is because you subscribe to the ideology of race. Because if you identify as a particular race, then you're going to naturally believe that this is a certain way that you have to think, and you might not be using critical thought. Okay, so George, analyze that one for me. I believe that anything that makes you assume rather than think is problematic, and I think race does that. So can you talk about Carlin's number 1 reason critical thinking might be a problem?
No doubt that is a huge and very relevant reason. Race is an assumption. Race is an assumption of one's intellectual ability compared to another's based purely on physical differences. And one of the reality-based ways that is demonstrating itself is just with the recent NFL pledge to stop this behavior, systemic practice in their organization called race norming. And race norming is a way that they use to determine, assess, and distribute compensation for injury to the retired football player due to concussions. And race norming assumes, it's a set of assumptions based on race. It assumes that the black football player starts out at a lower cognitive level than the white football player. And so when trying to determine damages and compensation, if you start out at a lower level of cognitive ability, then your loss is going to be less compared to the white ball player, who they assume has a higher level of cognitive ability. So that assumption is extremely dangerous, and it has real life consequences to not just in the area of football, but across all medical lines. They are using some aspect of race to make assumptions about how to treat and assess people. Very dangerous.
And what's amazing to me, and the fact that you bring that up, is that that it's actually critical thinking that would surely have someone. So is this identifying how pervasive the problem is of critical thinking, that you wouldn't have someone in that pipeline, someone in that organization who would ask the question and say, does this make sense? I mean, do we really, I mean, I just can't believe we don't have that. So is that how bad the problem really is with critical thinking?
I'm thinking the same thing. It's just like, how does a medical professional even allow this practice to continue? Why wouldn't a medical professional who clearly has been to all of these, really high level training educational institutions, let something like this continue? That's amazing. I can't really dream of the type of response or analysis that someone at that level of the game would put together in response to that question.
You've got degreed professionals. You've got all these people who've been in the sport for all these years, and then no one can speak up and say, "Hey, this does not make sense."
So where does he get that information, George? Where do you get that information from exactly? Was that something that you read off from the internet, or is it something that you honestly believe? With that being said,
about race norming,
the NFL information.
The NFL information.
Oh no! It's been in the news over the last few years, because we've had several NFL professionals be denied compensation. There's an actual pot of money that has been approved for compensation for players who have been injured in the league due to concussion. And so, but you have to go through the process and be assessed and diagnosed with the issue. And so once they started awarding those monies, you started to see the racial disparities come from that. You would see more white players get compensated, and the black players were continually getting turned down and denied.
And it's a real issue. All of this information is gathered through the news. So with that being said, do you believe everything the news outlets put out is factual information, or is it covering what you mentioned earlier, where you said what sells is emotion? Are you being led on the emotion of that, which has been put out through news medias?
Well, that wouldn't be critical thinking to believe everything in the media, and it also wouldn't be critical thinking to think that the news media is fake news. You have to do your own process of critical thought to arrive at what you think is a reasonable answer. So in terms of systemic disparities, and this being my area of expertise, I know the process. I have developed my own process of critical thought to determine and ferret out what are superfluous stories versus reality-based stories.
Yeah, and I think that's the key on that definition we talked about. It talked about objective analysis. And so because someone arrives at something, because, hey, every now and then somebody hits the lotto. In other words, every now and then, regardless of how fake the news is, sometimes they could be right, you know? And so
what's that cliche, even a broken clock?
Is right twice a day, yeah. So objective analysis is the key here. And so, yeah, so you can't really say. So, all right, let's go. Number one, I believe that, assumptions is bad, and race makes a lot of assumptions. So I think that hinders our critical thinking. Let's look at number two. Number two says experience and knowledge. And so this is Carlin's second reason critical thinking may be a problem. If your experience and knowledge makes you vulnerable to knowing it all. All right. So once you know it all, why continue to think about it? Because, and I think in a lot of cases, we believe that what we knew yesterday is also going to be pertinent for tomorrow and might not be the case. So that might be a problem with critical thinking. What do you have to say, George, on that one?
Yeah, well, in my profession, in the mental health profession, we have in our system is one where we're continually put in positions of having to learn and sometimes relearn principles, information, improvements, changes. You can never, in the mental health profession, you can never say you know it all, because it's just not that type of environment. But yet we do have people in our profession who still take that attitude as, yeah, I've got all experience. I've seen everything. I know it all. And it reflects, the very area of disparities that I'm trying to address in all of these other systems exist in the system of mental health, because we have this attitude. A lot of us do, unfortunately, have this attitude where we know everything. We've been to the highest degree schools. We've gotten all these awards and accolades. So we've arrived, and that becomes a dangerous position to be in, especially if you're serving other people.
Yeah, one of the things I over this past week, they played a lot of the Tulsa documentaries about the 1921 Tulsa massacre, and those were some of the questions I was asking. We were 100 years down the road, and saying, have people not asked these questions before? These are all seemingly such new questions 100 years later that nobody has been more critical about what took place there. And so I think there kind of was this where everybody knew what they knew, and that was going to be enough. And nobody said, let's ask more questions, and that's why I always talk to people about history. History, the facts of history might not change, but the questions you ask can give you a different view on the history that has passed. And so I think that's one of the things that we're talking about here, about we got to begin thinking differently so that we can ask different questions, and then we'll, begin looking at things differently. So that's number two. Let's go to number three. Number three is the fact that this is, Carlin's 3 reasons critical thinking may be your problem. Number 3 is they were never taught to think. And I put here that critical thinking is a learned skill. What do you say about that, George?
Well, I think that has been demonstrated just in the short time of this discussion, the aspects of what it takes to be critical thinking, objectivity being a prime aspect of that. One of the questions that I always like to ask, especially in my area in addressing the connection between mental health and race, is the question which you've heard me ask and seen me write 1,000 times: are you your color or are you your culture? So if I were to ask Peyton, if I were to ask you that question, are you your color or are you your culture? How do you interpret that question, and how would you answer it?
Are you color or are you, what was the culture?
As it refers to you, as far as how you identify. Are you your color or are you your culture?
Neither. However, I understand I understand viewpoints on both. You can judge me based on my appearance, but how I operate on a daily way of living, is how I approach things. So my approach is different. It has nothing to do with my color at hand and culture or where I come from. That has nothing to do with anything.
So do you have a cultural identity?
Do I have a cultural
Identity.
Do you have a culture? Do you see yourself? And these aren't right or wrong answer questions. They're just based on, how you see yourself. Do you, as the way you see yourself, do you have a cultural identity? And if so, what is it?
Being productive is all my cultural. Being
Applying
involved.
pressure.
Yeah, applying pressure. Being involved, like my mentor here at LTC, having a input, having knowledge, having wisdom, and sharing that amongst others that that's willing to put in that extra work.
And when I'm speaking culture, I'm speaking of origins, like German culture, Hispanic culture, African culture. Do you have a cultural identity in that area?
Of course, African American.
Hey, well, I'm wondering when he answers a question like that. Hey, we got to close out the show in 2 minutes, but I'm just thinking about this, and so George, you can give me your input on this. So when he answers the question of "Are you your culture?" and he defines his culture as something other than the ethnic, how valid is that?
Well, when I asked the question, when I asked that question, again, this is about critical thinking. The process is to get the person to think, right? Because I'm not looking for a particular answer from him. I'm looking for how that person is thinking. And most people haven't really thought about their own identity as far as it relates to race or culture. But here's the thing. What I can say about that type of answer is that typically those fall under a variety of cultures, because the definition of culture that I'm working with is one that a set of traditions, beliefs, practices, and behaviors that make totally distinct from another group. And that's not about a better than or worse than, just different. So if you're from Asia, you have a set of beliefs and practices that make you different from Africa versus America and those type of things. So that's generally what I'm speaking about. And so productivity, pressure, all those things may be unique to his particular personality, but they transcend all cultural boundaries, right? So we're looking for the things, when I'm asking the question, typically I'm looking for the things that makes that person unique in and of himself and the community that he represents.
All right. Hey, and that's going to round out our show today. I'm glad to have George and Peyton in here, and they finished out on this race. We started the show out talking about critical thought and critical thinking, and ultimately, because that was Carlin's number one reason that people do not think critically, and that is that idea of race. And so we kind of closed out on that note. So if you don't take anything else away from the show, take away that race inhibits your critical thought. All right. So I want to thank George. Thank you, George. I want to thank Peyton for being here.
Yes, sir.
And we thank you all for listening today and being here on Edge Radio, where the truth still matters.